Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We're here today to talk about family homelessness and student homelessness in particular. And as many of you know, family homelessness is a growing crisis across the United States. It's in rural, suburban, and urban areas. It's in your state, your town, and your city. Here at ICPH, the Institute for Children, Poverty, and Homelessness, we're dedicated to trying to understand more about homelessness. Where does it come from? What causes it? And importantly, not only how can we prevent and end family homelessness, but how can we really support kids who are experiencing homelessness and make sure that their housing status doesn't determine their life outcomes. So to further this cause, we recently embarked on a project with the city of Seattle, resulting in a new publication called the Seattle Atlas of Student Homelessness. And here with me today to talk about the Atlas and to highlight some of the really important and interesting findings, really not only for folks in Seattle, but across the U.S. I have our principal policy analyst and the lead researcher on the report, Josef Kannegaard, and also our director of communications, Frederick, Josef. Good morning, guys.
Good morning. Everyone, grab a coffee and let's get started. So I'm going to be moderating this discussion for the most part, and I guess I'll start by asking you guys, what made you want to focus on Seattle for this atlas?
Well, for several years, ICPH has been focusing on child and student homelessness in major cities. For several years, we've had a partnership with the New York City Department of Education, and we've been able to publish annual reports going into the educational outcomes of homeless students here in New York. And this year, for the first time, we're branching out and we did a report on Seattle. Now, a lot of people have been asking me, why Seattle? Why is Seattle the natural follow-up to New York? And the honest truth is that there wasn't any one, bit of data, any one trend that really grabbed us and told us that we had to do Seattle next. It really comes down to the people we were working with and their willingness to let us dig into the data and see wherever the analysis was going to go. Because we talked with people from around the country, and unfortunately, there's always this hesitancy to really kind of dig into homelessness numbers. Rightly or wrongly, student homelessness is often used as kind of this political weapon. So I think there's this kind of hesitation, this fear that even though that these reports and this data can help improve student outcomes, there will be negative impacts politically speaking.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. So I know that for the most part, ICPH has done most of its work in the New York City area. So there's a lot of familiarity with the main players in that space, whether it's people on the policy side, education side, shelter side, so on and so forth. So what did you find to be the most difficult thing breaking into that arena? Because as you said, there wasn't necessarily something that set the precedent for it in terms of, this is why we should do Seattle.
Well, of course, local context matters a huge amount. And also as an organization, we really believe that local solutions are key to trying to address family and student homelessness. And so just to piggyback on what Joe was saying, I think it really comes down to the two different kinds of partnerships we had. We had the partnership with Seattle Public Schools, which was the data sharing aspect of it, but it wasn't just about the data. It was also about feedback and context. We were working with their McKinney-Vento liaison and folks in their research office. And we also had several staff from the mayor's office who are working on issues around student homelessness, who could also help give us that local context. And whether that's things like actually everyone refers to this neighborhood as X as opposed to Y, or here's the kinds of things that people care about in Seattle that are getting traction right now. Having those sort of dual partnerships with the school district and also with the mayor's office, I think really positioned us well, and again also made us want to spend the kind of time and resources to put this report out, because we knew that the folks who would need to act on the data were the ones asking for it.
Gotcha. So with that being said, I imagine that being two major cities, two global cities if you would, you probably saw a lot of things in the data for Seattle that are very similar to New York. Could you speak on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and of course the scale is slightly different. New York has close to 100,000 homeless students. Seattle has just over 3,600. But when you look at the rate at which those student populations are growing, they're actually growing at nearly identical rates.
Oh, wow.
About 20%, a 20% growth rate in just 1 year. And then, you also see a lot of other kind of similarities. You might say that the disparities in terms of like lower test scores, increased behavioral problems, school discipline, suspensions, that sort of thing. But really, I think the thing that should stick out to kind of someone who isn't as familiar with this data as we are is just the fact that student homelessness, it's not a one-time, short-term kind of circumstance that these children have to experience and then it's over with.
Yeah.
The majority of these students in Seattle and in New York are experiencing homelessness as a chronic condition over multiple years. And in New York, we found that even once these students are permanently housed, once they are no longer homeless, you still see this lingering impact on their test scores.
Can you give an example of other forms of lingering impact besides test scores? Not just specific to Seattle, but generally.
Certainly in New York, we have a lot of data looking at chronic absenteeism and seeing that formerly homeless students continue to have very high rates of absenteeism. I mean, one of the reasons I think this issue is so important in the education sphere is not only because the number of homeless students is growing, but because it gives us this lens to really understand how the traumas of poverty impact the student experience and student outcomes. And where I think some of our most powerful findings come when we're able to distinguish the experience of homeless students from lower income students who have never been homeless. So we're in a way being sort of able to control for poverty, but it's this additional experience, this really kind of terrifying traumatic event where kids, they don't know where they're going to be sleeping at night, they don't know what's going to be going on with their family. And I think also another really important aspect in terms of thinking about the Seattle versus New York is that, yes, everything in New York, the numbers are higher, but when you break it down, what it means in Seattle is that 1 out of every 16 kids is homeless. And so that's, on average, at least 1 kid per classroom in Seattle. And in fact, over 90% of public schools in Seattle have at least 1 homeless student.
Jeez. So for a lot of people, a number like that, especially when you put it in context of looking at a classroom and having 1 student in that classroom at the very least being homeless, I imagine it's utterly surprising. So we work in the realm, so we've seen the numbers, we've seen the data, we've discussed these traumas before. But coming out of Seattle and the work that you've done there and having delved so deeply into that data, is there anything, or a few things rather, that you would say surprised you? So I know that, once again, you've been working on this for quite some time and it's very similar to New York, but things that really just caught you and you didn't think about it.
Yeah, I would say one of the things that surprised me the most was just the unique impact that homelessness has on these students above other types of disparities that we know about. So for example, as I was saying, we want to be able to control for poverty in some way so that we can see okay, this is the impact that, a family being low income is having on, test scores or the outcome, and here's the impact that housing instability is contributing. And really what we saw was over and over again, whether you were looking at test scores or school discipline, there was always this added effect that homelessness kind of imposed on students.
Is there anything from your end, Liz, that surprised you? Not just necessarily about specific numbers, but maybe also just the work in general and being in this new arena.
I think as I was just saying, that 90% number, just how widespread it is. I mean, I grew up in the Pacific Northwest, so for me also personally, this project felt a little bit like bringing some of, my own background into work. And you think of the Pacific Northwest, Seattle and Portland as these, sort of utopian kind of places. That's how they're played publicly, and they're of course beautiful, wonderful places. But this idea of how widespread and entrenched homelessness has been, that there are literally homeless kids in every single school, give or take.
Yeah.
And I also really was struck by some of the findings around the discipline, just the sort of additional, I guess, risk, if you will, of sort of how often homeless students are being suspended compared with students who are not homeless, and particularly with the younger kids, and just that they are more likely to sort of have more severe sort of consequences, if you will, compared with students who weren't homeless. I think it's a really important way to sort of understand how, again, that sort of trauma of homelessness can manifest itself. We're doing some other work right now that will be forthcoming in the next few months on some suspension work in New York. And, it's really about trying to find that balance between how does a teacher manage a classroom effectively, and also how do we continue to support children who we know are having these very difficult out-of-school experiences, and bringing some of that into the classroom, and what does that mean? But that really jumped out at me from Seattle.
So while doing this research and working with SPS, Seattle Public Schools, and other stakeholders in that realm, are there mechanisms in place right now to help with some of these things that have been found? So, for things like this discipline issues, suspensions, some of these traumas that take place for these students, how have you found that Seattle has put themselves in a place to react, respond, and overall help?
Yeah, so as we were, talking with the people from the SPS and in Seattle, and what we learned was really that Seattle has been very proactive in terms of instituting new programs, professional development, kind of developing really a curriculum around addressing some of these known opportunity gaps, whether it's helping students of lower socioeconomic status or of racial and ethnic minorities, helping them improve their academic performance, or even issuing a moratorium on certain types of suspensions in order to better address these kind of differences in how discipline policies have been applied. So it's really about kind of like taking that infrastructure that they've already put in place and kind of applying it to the challenges presented specifically by housing instability.
Gotcha.
Yes, I would definitely agree that Seattle overall as a city and SPS, they really want to be at the forefront of this work and of identifying and supporting homeless students. And this also is not the, for better or for worse, the solutions piece and the best practices is not exactly our wheelhouse. But I will say that I think that there's probably still more that can be done just around awareness and understanding. And we see this in New York City, where homelessness is even bigger, and we've been doing this work for a number of years, where we talk with school nurses and attendance officers on helping them understand what this looks like in the school district, so that they're better prepared to understand, to identify signs of when a student might be experiencing homelessness, to talk about what kind of questions to ask, and then what they should be doing once they have identified a homeless student, and ways to support them. And I also think that even though of course New York City and Seattle are very different, but with all of these cities and jurisdictions dealing with increasing student homelessness, I think there are some possible, real opportunities for, sharing the kinds of policies and practices that different cities are implementing. So if New York City is implementing social workers in schools with high student homelessness, what kind of return is New York City seeing on that kind of investment? And might that be something that a place like Seattle wants to consider? Or, we've done some of the work on health outcomes, where we've seen that while homeless high school students have less access than housed students to school-based health centers, but when they have access, they use them more, right? So, is that something that other cities like Seattle could look at and say, okay, well, do these students have access to doctors and nurses and basic kind of both physical and mental health? Who else out there is engaged in this work? And again, once we've identified the ways in which this specific population is different and has particular needs and challenges, then how can we all kind of learn from each other around how to best support them?
Yeah, that's a great point. So I actually think, Joe, you recently wrote a commentary piece pertaining to your work on Seattle, where you were very reflective in that same way on what not only Seattle could do, but generally, school systems around the country to not only identify, but potentially create these pathways, kind of as Liz was discussing, to provide the help and adequate resources and things of that nature, which once again is not necessarily ICPH's wheelhouse, but you create the data and the tools to help foster the conversations and the eventual next steps. So I don't know if you want to give us kind of a walkthrough through your reflection a bit.
Sure, absolutely. I think the main thing that we need to do kind of as a country, or at least as individual school systems, is to really change the conversation about how we think about homeless students, because as I mentioned earlier, there is this hesitation, this fear about publicizing the numbers around student homelessness, because any type of year-over-year growth is going to be used to punish those in power again, and there can be some valid criticisms if policies need to be improved, but for the most part, I think a lot of it is just kind of political opportunism. And so really what I'd like to see is kind of fostering this new culture of openness with the data, where members of the public, other teachers, researchers, anyone who wants to know can look at, okay, where are homeless students attending schools, how are they performing relative to their classmates, and really use that as a starting point to have these conversations and start thinking about, okay, well, what are the other types of programs, what are the really kind of innovations that we could be coming up with in order to better improve the academic outcomes for these students.
Wonderful. I mean, so it sounds to me as though many people, I'd imagine, looking at this data, looking at the general research that we do would think to themselves as more policy focused. But it sounds to me, based on what you just said, some of the things that Liz has said, that this is actually something that should be accessible and utilized by various audiences, from parents to educators to students going into certain realms. Would you agree with that, or?
I absolutely think it's important that everyone has access to this information for a few reasons. First of all, I think parents need to understand, I think we need to work on trying to remove the stigma around homelessness. So I think that parents who are not homeless, or perhaps are not even at risk of experiencing homelessness, they need to understand what's going on with these families and some of the things that we know about sort of the root causes and the experiences, so that they can relate to these families as just, here's another parent with a child in school who's just like me, and we're trying to get through the day and help our kids succeed. I think that's part of it. I also think that not all parents are aware of the rights that are afforded to their child if they become homeless, and I think that that's a really important piece of it also. I think what Joe was saying about innovations is really important, and I also would just add that conversely, I think it's important we make sure that whatever innovations are being put in place, perhaps system-wide, are also working for this specific population. So I think we know we're in a more resource-strapped environment than almost anybody would prefer. So how do we make sure that this really particularly vulnerable population, but also a population that we have some real evidence that if things are done correctly can succeed, can graduate from high school, go on to college, can be supported to all sorts of really positive outcomes, that we're bringing them along with us for the ride and making sure that they're not kind of getting left over in the corner.
Gotcha. I mean, that's extremely well said. So our time is about up, but I will ask each of you, because of the fact that, once again, ICPH's work is predominantly in New York City, very specifically focused, but you've done Seattle. So now that you've accomplished Seattle, do you have a dream city that you'd love to take a look at for another atlas or some other potential reports or briefs?
Just from a geographic standpoint, I would love to look at a large metropolis like Los Angeles.
Okay.
Because Los Angeles, I would imagine, like New York, you have so much issues around even just transportation of getting these students to school. It's an added barrier. And so I would be really interested to see kind of like what solutions they've come up with so far in Los Angeles, and just how their homeless students are doing overall.
I would vote for Dallas. I've read a few interesting articles about some work going on in Dallas around homeless students, and it sounds like there's some real momentum there for sort of paying attention to this population and identifying them. So I would love to kind of get in there and get my hands on the data and see how we can help support the more programmatic work that's kind of going on in Dallas. I think DC would be really interesting. I mean, you know, almost anywhere, and I'll tell you why. I would be happy to have their data, but Dallas is sort of the top of my list right now.
Gotcha. Well, I'm hoping that at some point we get to tackle those places. And wonderful job, Joe, once again. And you know, I'm sure that the people of Seattle are greatly appreciative. And everyone, thank you for joining us. We hope that you'll take a look at the Seattle Atlas. You can find that at icphusa.org/Seattle Atlas. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us at info@icphusa.org. Have a good day.